Donald Trump's niece, Mary Trump, has spoken out ever more vociferously against the former and would-be US president. She has called him a maniac with a craven need for revenge and a man who has done nothing but fail upwards all his life. And this is also personal because Mary Trump's father was disinherited by the grandfather, Fred Trump, who had left Germany to avoid military service and then made a fortune from brothels in Canada. Donald became the favoured son. Mary's family were disinherited. It's a grim story, but for one of his political foes, Mary Trump has had a uniquely intimate view of the man who may again be elected president by the end of the year. As Trump digests a $350 million fine from the state of New York for fraudulent business practices, Mary's view of where his campaign has got to is very much worth hearing, and I'm glad to say she joins me now. Mary Trump, very good to talk to you. Let me just start at the beginning. You've been part of the family. You've seen Donald Trump close up. What would you like to say about him as, a person you know well? That perhaps the ordinary voter, the ordinary observer, particularly from the United Kingdom, would not get?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I think one of the most telling things about Donald is that he has not changed since I knew him growing up. And that may sound benign, but that is not how human beings are supposed to evolve. He continues to be a bully. He continues to be somebody who revels in grievance and, quite honestly, who can't actually accomplish anything on his own. This is a dangerous person. We already know, because he's telling us that if he does manage to get back into the White House again, his entire administration will be about settling grievances and getting revenge on his political opponents.
So in a sense, you're saying he hasn't evolved from brat.
Yeah, that's precisely right. When he was young, I think one of the main reasons we're here right now is when he was very young, at a very crucial developmental period in his life. His mother was absent due to serious illness, and his father, my grandfather, was a sociopath. So he didn't get the comfort and the nurturing he needed at a young age. And then when he got older, those rifts were never repaired. And for reasons that are too complex to get into right now, he became my grandfather's favored son. And ever since then, he has found proxies for my grandfather to enable him through his most egregious failures. And the Republican Party in the United States is continuing to do that today.
And one of the very interesting things I learned from your book is that the favourite phrase inside the Trump family of praise was, he's a killer. You're a killer. You've got to be a killer. Explain what killer means in this context.
It's a little mystifying because my grandfather was a landlord, so I'm not entirely sure why that quality was so important to him. But I think it stood in for this sense that any kind of gentle qualities, any sensitivity, any kindness, any generosity was seen by him as weakness, and weakness could not be tolerated. That's one of the many reasons my dad had such a terrible time in the family. So Donald stood up, and instead of being an actual killer, he became somebody who would destroy his enemies in real estate by suing them or outspending them in lawsuits. And it became this pattern so that we're still living with now, because he now has people to do his bidding for him. The irony here is that Donald is one of the weakest, most pathetic people I've ever known in my life. And yet people who support him, people who are on his side politically, are afraid of him. And that, too, is mystifying.
It really is weird. And another thing that's mystifying, in a sense, is his reputation of being a brilliant deal maker and business person. He's just lost $350 million in this lawsuit. Where does that put him and, as it were, the family business in New York?
Well, in New York, the business is essentially over, at least temporarily, because one of the things the judge in the case did was continue the oversight of the company. So this is a third party who now has de facto control over how money gets spent, how it doesn't get spent, how Donald can spend money. And both Donald and his two adult sons are no longer allowed to do business in New York for 2 or 3 years. It's going to be very difficult for them to get loans, which they need. This judgment, which, by the way, also has added on to it 2% interest. So right now, he owes $450 million. And that, of course, is before we even factor in the $83 million for having been found liable for raping E. Jean Carroll. So it's going to be very telling to see if he has that kind of money, and if not, where he gets it from. And that's what we, American citizens and people around the planet who care what happens to American democracy, really need to start paying attention.
So for him, it really is win the presidency again or bust. And I mean bust literally.
Yeah. And again, despite the 4 indictments, the 91 criminal charges, this incredible loss, not just of money that you just pointed to, but the loss of his totally mythological reputation as a successful businessman, still don't seem to be enough to get the Republican Party to move on. And that's actually a little terrifying.
We've experienced Donald Trump once as US president. Do you think he's become more dangerous since he lost last time round?
Oh, he's much more dangerous now because, one, he's increasingly unhinged. The more desperate he gets, the more judgments there are against him, the more he becomes actively involved in these criminal trials, which haven't even started yet. The first one isn't slated to start until March. The less in control he's going to feel, the more he's going to lash out. What makes him even more dangerous, though, is we've had 3 years now during which his big lie that the election was stolen, which of course it was not, has gained traction in the Republican Party. And the entirety of the Republican Party now seems to think that the fact that Donald incited an insurrection against our country doesn't matter.
And Jon Stewart, the Daily Show host, who's very famous in the States, did a quite effective comic skit comparing Donald Trump and Joe Biden, but you took some offense at that. You think it's not a right or correct comparison to make. Can you explain why?
Sure. No, all due respect to Jon Stewart, he has a right to say whatever he wants, and I am a firm believer that comedians should be completely unfettered in their right to free speech. However, Jon Stewart has for years now put himself out as kind of a standard bearer, a leader in the zeitgeist of American politics. So when he speaks, he's not just speaking as a comedian. And for him to do this both sides thing about Biden's age is truly bordering on dangerous, because this is the most important, crucial election of our lifetime. And you just cannot compare Joe Biden's age and all of Donald's anti-American, pro-fascist, not ideology, he doesn't have ideologies, but his rhetoric and his actions. So I found it disturbing that Stewart was willing to be so flip about the circumstances.
Yeah, I get that, absolutely. You've talked about his appetite for revenge or vengeance, and he's talked about his appetite for revenge as well. Do you think that if he wins next time, American democracy itself, that great precious heritage that your country has, is in real danger?
I think it's over, quite honestly.
Over.
And not only that, global democracy, Western liberal democracy, is in serious danger. We've heard recently that Donald would give Vladimir Putin, an American enemy, an enemy to Western democracy, the green light to invade Europe if European members of NATO don't contribute more money. So on the one hand, he doesn't have any idea what he's talking about in terms of how NATO works. And secondly, he's made it very clear who he considers his allies to be.
So that makes it sound it's the most important election in the entire history of the United States. One reflection, furthermore, on all of this, you mentioned Putin. There was an extraordinary statement by Donald Trump today in which he appears to compare himself with Mr. Navalny, who was murdered by Putin in a Siberian prison camp at the weekend, as if he, Donald Trump, is the same kind of political prisoner, the same kind of martyr, the same kind of victim as somebody as courageous and pro-democracy as Navalny. Your thoughts on that?
It's despicable. Alexei Navalny had more, I would say he had more courage in his little finger than Donald has in his entire body, but Donald has no courage at all. What we also need to be clear about in that statement, he doesn't even mention Navalny's murderer, Vladimir Putin. It was just, it was actually, it would have been better, honestly, if Donald had just said nothing.
Because he implied that he didn't really think he'd been murdered in the first place. Now, finally, we've talked a lot about Donald Trump. Let just me ask you, as it were, a different kind of question, which is where you think the Trump campaign has got to now. Do you think it is an inevitable march towards the White House, which is sometimes the impression we get in the UK?
No, it's not inevitable. I know that a lot of American media make it seem that way because apparently they've not learned the lessons of the election in 2016, and they make it much more about the horse race than the stakes. But first of all, Donald has not even secured the nomination, so we're not even in the general election yet. We're not going to know until people start paying attention, and that won't be for another 3 months or so, or maybe not even until the summer when the conventions are held. So it is not inevitable by any stretch of the imagination. Joe Biden has been the most effective American president in my lifetime, and I think as soon as people start comparing their records, that will clarify a lot of things. But honestly, it shouldn't even be close, and that is worrisome.
Well, listen, it hasn't been a conversation characterised by sunny optimism, but it's been really, really interesting. Lea Trump, thank you so much for talking to LBC.